Hello everyone, today we'll be going through the next piece of content for Unit 1, starting with Section 1.2, the distinction between the public and private sector. As you'll see, this is Assessment Objective 2 level, so we might encounter this in kind of 4-mark questions, potentially, or as always, it can be used heavily in the essay length responses, and we'll take a look at how this might appear on the final examinations in a moment, but let's get straight into it. The public sector. So this is the first kind of category we can place a business in. These are businesses owned and controlled by the government. They may or may not be operated by the government itself. You do see these kinds of businesses every day. If you go to a public school, if you go to a public hospital, these are businesses owned and controlled by the government. There are examples, of course, of businesses controlled by the government, not operated by the government. Famously, the metro systems in Hong Kong and Singapore, they are government-owned and controlled businesses, but the operations aren't conducted by government employees. It is set up as a separate company. So there is like a slight distinction there, but it doesn't change the fact of them being public sector. Now, some features of a public sector organization. They're financed from public funds. So the money for their setup, for their ongoing operation, for any additional investment in capital equipment will come from public funds. So from the taxes that people pay, or from the profits that have previously been made by that public sector organization. Generally speaking, these kinds of businesses provide essential goods and services. There are notable examples of this. Some large corporations, arguably some of the largest in the world, such as Saudi Aramco, are public sector organizations. The government of Saudi Arabia owns 100% of Saudi Aramco. But in all cases, regardless of whether it's providing an essential good or service or it's driven by profit, the public are the primary stakeholders in these businesses. So the government owns the business, the people of a country, if it's a democratic country, of course, control who is in government. Therefore, the people of the country are the ones that the business answers to, the organization answers to. There is not a strong profit motive in these businesses. Instead, they are focused on the provision of that good or service. It's not to say that profits can't be made. I talked about briefly metro systems just a moment ago. I did once live in Moscow, Russia, and it's got quite an extensive metro system owned by the government of Moscow. And it made quite a healthy profit year on year, but that profit was consistently reinvested into opening more metro stations and improving the level of service. And this is typical of what you see around the world, is that the profits generated from these public sector organizations are reinvested into the service to make it better. It's not common for profit taking to occur. And if that profit taking does occur from one public sector organization, typically it's redirected to another area of the public sector, right? So there's no one drawing a dividend from a public sector organization. So the private sector, these are businesses owned and controlled by private individuals or other private businesses, because businesses can own parts of other businesses. And the primary purpose here is generating a profit for all owners. By and large, these are the businesses with which you engage on a daily basis. So there are a lot of private sector organizations, but the majority of businesses do operate in the private sector rather than the public sector. So some features of these private sector organizations. So profits are earned if it's a successful business, and it won't last long if it doesn't earn a profit. And the owners expect that profit. The owners have invested capital into that organization, and they are expecting a return from that. That makes them the primary stakeholders in that business. There's little or no government involvement in daily operations in this case. Now, I say little because, of course, the government is an external stakeholder of just about every business. The government has laws in place to govern the way that business is done. Sometimes the government even offers subsidies, or the government is a customer of these private sector organizations. So there is, in almost every case, some government involvement in a private sector organization, but not in the day-to-day operations of how things are done. And as mentioned, the most important is that it's funded privately or from a majority of private funds. Again, there are some situations in which the government may be contributing as a customer or through subsidies, but the majority of the money for the business is coming from private funds. Now, talking generally speaking, there are far more private sector businesses than public, but this varies significantly by country. Countries that have, more of a total control by the government tend to have a higher level of public enterprise. So China, one of the largest economies in the world, operating under the Communist Party of China, has quite a high level of public ownership in companies and public control over large companies, sometimes in ways that are not immediately apparent from the outside, but it does exist. Even in places like the United States of America, the government is a very large employer, and there are a lot of public organizations that contribute heavily to the economy of the country. But we're talking in general that the largest number of businesses that are out there are private. There is a perception among many that the public sector is inefficient and bureaucratic, which is why many public organizations over the years have been sold off to private businesses so that they can be more efficient. Places like the UK sold off the rail network to private companies with the idea that the private companies would be much more efficient in operating them than the public sector. This works in many cases, but not in others, right? So although it is a perception, it's not always the case that public is more inefficient. And most businesses you interact with, the place you buy your coffee, maybe the school you go to even, will be private. So there is a common, confusion that can happen that we need to get out of the way, which is this term publicly traded. So we've just talked about the private sector and the public sector as the two broad categories in which organizations are in. Publicly traded can sound like it's part of this conversation, but it's really not. So publicly traded is a term that applies to private sector companies. Not all private sector companies. These are private sector companies that are incorporated, that have shares listed on stock exchanges. So a private sector company in which you can buy shares on a stock exchange is publicly traded. This has nothing to do with the public sector. Okay? It means that just the shares can be purchased freely on the open market. So you might this term isn't part of the syllabus, but you may come across it when you're looking at articles or doing research for IAs and EEs. So just be aware that publicly traded has zero relationship with public sector. It in fact applies directly to private incorporated companies. Investments. So there are some areas in which the government can be very much involved in the private sector through investment. Pension funds and sovereign wealth funds all around the world that are controlled by governments do invest in private businesses. They own stakes in private businesses. Famous sorts of airlines the government of their country has some stake in those airlines. And unless the government takes a controlling stake and actually takes over the operations, those companies do remain private. They stay under the umbrella of a private company. So if the government pension fund of Canada owns 10% of the company, they have a stake in that company, sure. They have some level of government ownership of that company, but the company is still a private sector company because the government with that 10% does not have a controlling stake. Once we get up to the 51% threshold of controlling stake of a company, then we can get to the gray area of, does this change from a private to a public company? Even if maybe the shares are still available to others, has the government now taken a controlling stake? So that's private and public sector covered. Remember, every business falls under one of those two categories. In the next video, we're going to look at profit-based organizations and the first kind of category of profit-based organization, which is a sole trader. Thank you for tuning in. If you want more business management videos, please subscribe and explore the Unit 1 playlist or the playlist for any other units in the syllabus. Thank you.